Hey gamers, welcome to another bonus XP episode of the RPGaymer podcast. You can call me Asters, and today we are here with our beautiful and illustrious host Patrick to talk about
That's me.
to talk about the cult classic Squaresoft horror RPG Parasite Eve. So sit back, relax, and let's get mitochondria on with it.
Oh, could you stop with the mitochondria joke? You're never in charge again.
We did our last bonus XP about Parasite Eve 2, and
Correct.
Some people might be a little bit curious as to why we are kind of going backwards, which there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But
I mean, it's just recency bias. Like,
Yeah.
you and I both had played Parasite Eve 2 first, or like most recently. So like it would just make sense to do that.
Yeah, no, for sure. And so I had, recently played both of them in succession for the first time, pretty closely back to back. And you were there for a lot of that back and forth kind of coaching and just, commenting on my experience and everything like that. And so we've been talking about it off the record, and we have a pretty good idea of how we both feel about these games. But I think our audience would be very curious to kind of hear what we have to say about the first Parasite Eve. So I guess, just kind of going into the game as a whole, it's very easy to talk about, Parasite Eve 2 as the quote-unquote sequel to the first game, but Parasite Eve 1 was a very interesting case because, and I was actually watching K-Bash's video on the series a couple days ago.
The best.
Yes, and he put it really well when he said that Parasite Eve 1 is essentially an adaptation sequel of a book in video game format that is framed cinematically, which I thought was really interesting.
It's literally like if it also was a musical / rap album, I think it would cover all forms of media in that sense.
For sure, absolutely, yeah. Just the a little bit other bit of research that I kind of came across while enjoying my my dill pickle flavored popcorn.
Trader Joe's?
No, from Aldi actually.
Oh well, Aldi is Trader Joe's.
Really?
Like it's the same company.
Oh my goodness! All right,
it's the same company, dog.
We're gonna have to have a whole other podcast for that.
Congratulations, you're woke now.
Oh my god, I've been traded to Joe. I've realized that Parasite Eve was Squaresoft's first ever M-rated title, which is really weird to think about. But also makes sense.
The Final Fantasy VII wasn't M-rated?
No, I think it was T for teen. I could see it. I don't think it would have been able to sell gangbusters if it was M.
That makes sense because there are some scenes and whatnot that I believe it, but now that you're saying it was teen and not M,
I think it's specifically because of just the FMVs in Parasite
sure.
Eve.
Yeah, because they're wild.
I was not fortunate enough to grow up with the game like you were, but I can imagine that opening scene in the opera probably affected you in some way, shape, or form. No?
So had I not played Resident Evil 1 with my brother prior, it would have, but I think Resident Evil 1, even though they're much more grotesque in Parasite Eve 1, but I think Resident Evil 1 really set the tone for the gore, because I can't think of games before that were that. I don't know, it's funny thinking it from this perspective now, graphically of graphical fidelity that gory, because I played other games back in the day, like the original Alone in the Dark on PC, and it was scary, but it wasn't gory. So I think you're hitting on the head there. We're getting into some of that, but didn't phase me. It was just kind of like, cool.
I guess what I feel like would have freaked out a lot of kids is just the framing of that opening scene in the opera, because it's like, it's one thing when you see like a horror scene where it's like, yeah, someone gets killed, but you're seeing a huge opera house filled with people who are just dying and spontaneously combusting left and right.
Oh yeah, someone's eye like legit busts open, and they like ooze goop. Or is that later, or is that
I think that's a little bit later at the sports stadium where that everyone just melts.
Oh, in the zoo.
Yeah.
Oh no, you're talking about later, right?
In the park.
Yes. Yeah.
Where there's just like a concert going on in a sports stadium that just happens to be in the middle of a park. That was, honestly, now that I'm thinking about it, some weird locales.
Well, but that is like, I can't confirm. I will be able to next week, but isn't that Central Park? Like,
does it have a giant stadium in it?
I wouldn't be surprised if it does.
That goes to show. Like, I cannot be bothered to drive in New York, so I know next to nothing about it. So if there are any New Yorkians who are listening to this podcast who are offended, I'm glad.
I'll follow up with a comment after we go there next week, literally, and I'll let you know. But yeah, I know it's weird to think of that locale, but I'm sure it does. But yeah, gross. Yeah, gross scenes, M-rated.
Yeah, and it's actually funny that you mentioned Final Fantasy VII, because I believe they were working around with the concepts for both games around the same time, because Hironobu Sakaguchi had actually been playing around with a version of Final Fantasy VII in which you are like a detective investigating like weird happenings in like a modern city. I think there were a lot of parallels to kind of Midgard and the New York that's depicted in Parasite Eve.
I guess I can see that a little bit. I think had you stayed in Midgard,
oh yeah, absolutely, because like Midgard is only like 1/4 of the game.
Well, and it's very like futuristic modern versus the rest of it kind of feels a little bit more fantasy,
for sure, yeah.
Like and whatnot. So yeah, well, okay, let's talk about this game. Let's talk about this like modern take of America and the sci-fi shit that goes down.
So the game, like, it starts out in this this opera house setting with just everything just goes balls to the walls almost like a few minutes in. It starts out with our character Aya basically just negging this guy that she has like very apprehensively accepted a date from. And like I know we talked about the characterization of her in the second game and how it's not as fleshed out in the first one, but I do really enjoy kind of like her just shoving her date out of the way, like off
she like
screen.
hip checks him, right?
Yeah. And so we immediately start into kind of the exploration, and we do get into the battle system.
I have
and
a
stuff.
question there. Did you find it weird that he survived? Like, were we supposed to feel bad if he didn't spontaneously combust when like everyone else did?
I definitely wouldn't have been mad, because later in the game there's that like racist cop that's like really shitty to Maeda, who immediately like bursts into flame. Yeah. So it's like I'm wondering if like he was more of just a device to just showcase Aya's initial personality of just like, I'm not here for you, dude.
Right.
You're not like, worth bursting into flames.
But I just always found that weird that like what is it? What narrative purpose does it serve that like some people survive the beginning part, that he survived, that like essentially there's no rhyme or reason to it from what we know. To
be fair, as much as I do love the 10 TED Talks worth of like mitochondria mumbo jumbo that we get told in the story,
my God, too much.
It's there's kind of no rhyme or reason to it. It really just is a bunch of mumbo jumbo for the sake of plot, and doesn't really go a whole lot into why didn't the entire audience burst into flames. It's just, I think those are kind of just things that fell by the wayside.
The mitochondria train goes woo, woo and then I spontaneously combusted. So okay, yeah, New York. every scene you go to, something supernatural is going on. I think like I don't want like we don't want to recap the game
Of course,
too
yeah,
much, but I think it's a good way to set the tone. Like, how cool is it when you walk on the stage for the first time? And it's pretty much it is your first combat, and there's like a full-on opera track going on as you're running around and this woman's firing laser beams at you.
Oh
Like,
yeah,
that's
amazing soundtrack by Yoko Shimomura. Shimamoto.
I don't know. I don't know though.
Amazing soundtrack that just like and just that weird digitized opera music that is just like is so unsettling for this first encounter that you're essentially facing the final boss as the first boss, and so it's like it immediately establishes that that main character and foil dynamic between Aya and Eve. And obviously, she's giving all of these vague hints at like, oh, you should recognize me or something like that because like we have the same stuff going on. And I was like, what?
So I think this is where I struggle with the game a little bit, and you kind of brought it up a little bit in terms of just kind of like the story and the pacing and whatnot, where you have these like really cool scenes of like shit going down, people bursting into flames, not being able to go to other people not being able to go into areas because of like the mitochondrial field that Eve is putting out, that they'll die, and these like freak mutations of animals and whatnot. But then you have this like heavy juxtaposition of these like really stale science parts that like overly explain what's going on, where basically they're cramming the novel in. And I really struggle with that both then and now, just because like it's tedious to go through, it's not really that interesting, and it's not written well.
So I have something of a counter argument to that, where
do it.
So going back to that comment from or statement from K-Bash's video about it being framed very cinematically, I would not consider cinematic to be synonymous with good. So for instance, like in the movie Inception, like when that movie came out, like everyone was like, whoa, crazy, super crazy cinematography and like action scenes. I remember seeing that movie in theaters and honestly not knowing what the absolute fuck they were talking about. Like the majority of the movie, I still really didn't understand by the end of the movie what was going on. But every scene where something crazy was happening, I was just like, silly dumb monkey, woohoo! Like I was having a blast, and I think that's kind of the mindset I went in with this game, where the dumb sciencey stuff that kept getting brought up and like really dug into, I didn't really care about it. I was able to kind of simplify it down to this stuff inside of us is getting mad and it wants to do stuff outside of us.
Yeah, and I let me put it this way. I think it is important to have context, and I don't think that like just using the sciencey stuff as our term like is bad.
Oh, of course.
I think it's just how drastic and drab it is because it's an info dump. And if we think of this as like a cinematic game, like if it's something that's kind of like mimicking the pacing of a movie in a sense. Did you ever read 1984?
A long time ago in school.
So, like the first 60 pages of the book are pretty great, and the last 60 pages of the book are great, but then you get like the history of the world, and it's like great dense stuff and whatnot, but it's just so boring to read. And like I get it, like all that stuff can be really important, but it has to be, especially because we're playing a game, something digestible. And that's where I struggle with this game a little bit, where I am playing a game. I think a game can be art, and I think it can be like this beautiful way to interpret things, but you've got to keep the interest going. And unfortunately, because everyone is just like a flat character for the most part, there's nothing really that was like, but I need I need to keep going with that.
Yeah.
So I remember the third time I played it, or maybe even the fourth, because I've played it a handful of times now. Like when I get to those scenes, it was just like XXXX all the way through to get through as fast as possible.
That's fair. I wouldn't be surprised if during the process of development, because I know they got the original the writer for the original Parasite Eve book at the very least as like, you know, a consultation to kind of like, you know,
Sure.
you know, build stuff with. I would not be surprised if the extent of that consultation was just, you know, the science stuff that they kind of just copied and pasted into the dialogue for like
it's very
parts
that.
with like Dr. Clamp and stuff, who was like very clearly evil. Like you meet
very
him for the first
very
time,
much the bad
it's just
guy,
like so immediately suspicious. Like, and I hadn't realized that. So they do mention at some point, because when Maeda shows up, he says like, oh, something like this happened on a smaller scale in Japan. It never occurred to me that's literally the book that he's talking about, like the story from
Truly.
the book. And so it's like people who hadn't have read the book probably wouldn't have thought of that and wouldn't have that context and would just be like, oh, I guess this is something that has happened somewhere else, and just like wouldn't have understood the sort of kind of fourth wall-y you know, like presence of the other media outside of the game.
It almost makes me wonder if, and I don't know how you feel about this, that maybe like the game came too soon for what like Square's side teams were able to do at the point. Because when you're saying like, not that it was a literal copy and paste, but maybe they just didn't have the team to really dig into the material to like translate it in an acceptable format for gamers. Because I just finished playing Alan Wake 2, another like survival horror game. Not, this is more RPG for sure, but there are some really dense parts in what's going on, but it's at least processed in a way that there's ambiguity. You're not supposed to understand everything, and you can be at peace with that, but then you also get to understand the other half of it. So there's this, and it's also like all processed in a really like fun, interesting way. So I'm wondering, like, did this game get released too soon to the point where like we didn't have what we have now in terms of just like narrative intentions and how we build a narrative and how we process it and whatnot?
So I believe the book came out in 1995 and the game came out in 1998. And
well, is that the U.S. or is that the Japan release? As I think, for some reason, I think it's 97 when we were doing our research last time. But
yeah.
It's around there. Regardless, it's around there.
It was still, by the time we did get it, it was around, pretty close to the end of the PlayStation 1 cycle. So I'm wondering if they had taken more time, we probably could have had a much more fleshed out story and incorporation of the book's more science-esque like elements thrown in. But then by that point, honestly, I could imagine it would have been released around the time that Parasite Eve 2 did. And then it's like, okay, now do we move Parasite Eve 2 onto the PS2 while just the whole landscape of video games is changing so rapidly at that point, and like kind of how I mentioned in the Parasite Eve 2 video episode, Sakaguchi was just like, no team was staying together after their respective game was done. He would just spread them all out to different projects, and so there wasn't a whole lot of consistency in what everyone was bringing to the table for each project.
Right, and that's kind of why we see the incomplete trend of a lot of Square Enix games, like Xenogears, Chrono Cross. Some people say Final Fantasy VIII in there as well. I think we talked about that in the last episode. But and I mean, like that was just like Square Enix at the time. Like they didn't necessarily hit home on a lot of their games. But
I mean, talking about modern Square Enix with like Kingdom Hearts 3, Final Fantasy 15, they kind of sort of have unfortunately kept up that that pace.
Yeah, well, again, like but it depends because I think we saw a wave of success and completion definitely into the PS2 era with their stuff. Like I think a lot
Oh,
of
for
their
sure.
titles,
Oh, yeah.
you definitely like they have a solid vision.
Oh,
but
I'm sure there were different elements that led up to kind of Square Enix's 2010s anti-Renaissance, if you will.
Yes, please don't. We're not allowed to mention it. Okay, but back to Parasite Eve.
Yes.
So like narrative aside,
yeah, I'd love to talk about the mechanics and like the battle system and everything.
Yeah, so I obviously like at the time when it's coming out, you have this game that is basically an action RPG. It's you get to move around and dodge and whatnot. Thought that was the coolest thing. However, coming back to that is a little tough. But I want you to I want to hear what you think about that.
So it being I played the games in order, and having them so close together, I initially was not a huge fan of it, mostly because I was not paying attention to the mechanics. I did not know about like the gun customization. I did not know about keeping myself, constantly leveling up and like customizing armor to meet specific things. By the time I
and to be fair, like aside from maybe passing on the plus bonuses to your guns, like that's more New Game Plus territory where it really matters, versus like just the standard game.
Oh, I mean, I maybe I'm just a really bad player because I felt like it mattered. It mattered for my first playthrough. And once I started realizing that I could more or less farm encounters, I got used to the system, and for the most part, aside from a couple of bosses, I enjoyed the battle system pretty throughout the game. I was actually one of the few games where I was like looking forward to encounters. The only time where I wasn't was in the sewers with the goddamn bats that blind you and make all of like your shots miss like 80% of the time. That drove me insane. And that is when I found out that you can run out of ammo very easily, and that you can only raid the ammo box in the police station so many times before you need to just farm ammo from enemy encounters. So I
think that's one of the reasons why they remedied that in the sequel. Here's how I see it. Moving around, pretty seamless. I think it's great. I think the exception is I don't necessarily like, with the exception of the boss battles, because I think they really do a good job with the boss battles, but in the random encounters, which I know that they're like semi-staged, not truly random, but I don't think that the maps are always curated for it. And I felt very often you're getting in battles in these like super narrow rooms,
right,
or hallways, and there's just no intentionality behind the design, where when you think of survival horror games, there typically is like there's typically some intention of where monsters are, where they're coming from, and then like what you can use or not use to your advantage to move around and dodge and whatnot. I also feel like the part that's frustrating for me is I think you and I talked about this on the Discord, where the fewer shots you take, the more damage you do. And I just don't think that makes sense. If I'm pumping you full of 10 bullets, each one of those bullets should be doing the same amount of damage.
Yes, I was going through, I think I was at like 70% through the game or 60% before one of the Discord members like mentioned that mechanic, and I was like, what? Because all of my guns, I was putting that +5 bullet buff on, and
because you're like I get to shoot you more and around, especially having to wait to be able to do
because
anything.
the ATP gauge goes slower when you have more bullets. So when I switched to 2, I was like, oh wow, this feels much better.
And if, like you're saying, if you aren't the greatest at the game and just in terms of dodging, are you constantly having to use your turn to heal.
Yeah.
So usually whenever I like cater my opinions to Parasite Eve and like which one I prefer, it is typically 2, because even though you would say like 2 is less RPG, more survival horror, I almost feel like it fits better because there are a lot of reasons that like this doesn't completely work. But I'm not saying it's a bad game. I love Parasite Eve 1. I love what it has done. I think, like there are a lot of great things to it, but I do have some slight issues with, the set. I think it was a good like stepping stone.
So
and I think it did some things better than, like a lot better than Parasite Eve 2 does. I'm definitely going to admit that.
So I'm curious about how you feel about Parasite Eve 1 having that RPG label more heavily attached to it than 2. How do you feel like it does borrow elements from more traditional RPGs to, I guess, like kind of deserve or earn that label?
So one thing that like I find interesting when people label RPGs, like I tend to think of RPGs as a game where you do get to have some input or say and customization of your character. And I don't completely feel like that in Parasite Eve 1. I feel like Parasite Eve 1 is really just the numbers game, and then whatever mitochondria abilities Aya has at the time. And like like they just keep getting better and better as you go, whereas almost like Parasite Eve 2 to me personally almost feels more like an RPG.
You are leveling up the PE abilities into like that makes more sense. Yeah.
And well, not only that, like it's just choice. Like I think RPGs are about choice. So like, you get to pick your loadout, and like all of the guns are pretty well viable. All of the armors are pretty well viable, and you can build your parasite energy how you want. And that's not something that you can really do in Parasite Eve 1.
I would argue that narratively in Parasite Eve 1, it almost actually kind of makes a little bit more sense that you don't have as much control over your PE abilities because she's discovering these powers for the first time, and they're kind of just coming to her in a narrative sense, if that makes sense.
Well, but this could be one of those things, like, again, had this game been made later, we can't change that, and I get that. Yeah. And again, I'm prefacing this heavily. I really love this game. I'm just critiquing it because that's what we do, and I think that's okay. You're allowed to critique art if you have a problem
Everybody
with it.
put your pitchforks away. Yeah. Patrick's okay.
Go somewhere else. But, like, maybe it could be one of those things where, like, based on how you're doing, because we're talking about evolution, new abilities awaken. So, like, if you're taking a lot of hits, you get a defense spell. But if you're not taking a lot of hits and you're doing a lot of damage, the game could lean into that, being like, okay, I'm going to give you more attack boosting spells and attacking spells. So, like, I almost feel like I think the difference between Parasite Eve 1 and Parasite Eve 2 is Parasite Eve 1 is just strictly linear. Like in narrative, in build and whatnot. Like, yes, I know you get to choose your gun, and yes, I know that you can kind of customize it, but again, better gun, better pistol, you know what I mean? And there's little wiggle rooms for customization. But in Parasite Eve 2, everyone's experience is going to be different narratively because there are a lot of things you can miss, and build wise, because there are a lot of different ways that you could pick how to do your character. Are there better ways? Potentially, yes, but still everything is viable. And I don't think it's necessarily bad. I think it's just a symptom of what we considered an RPG at the time. Because if you take a look at a lot of these JRPGs we love, like Lunar Silver Star Story just got announced yesterday, and I love that game too. Narratively, super solid game, but like you go back and play it and you think of all the things that you can do in an RPG now, it's hard to go back because you're like, man, these characters just get the spells that they get, like, so I'm just witnessing this story and I don't have much choice. And I personally feel like one of the biggest assets of an RPG is choice.
That's fair. And I do agree that I do enjoy the customization and the variety for builds that Parasite Eve 2 does give you over 1. And I think
but the music is butts.
The music is
so
definitely
bad.
way worse.
It's so bad in 2. Parasite Eve 1 soundtrack. Oh my god.
The song that plays when you're in like when you're in the police station, the like
yeah.
Oh,
like that
vibes
is a
for
bop.
days.
Yeah. And you know, you have your anytime like they are explaining the lore of the game, you get that intense like piano track, which is pretty nice. The boss track absolutely lives rent free in my mind. Like that is one that never disappears. The regular battle music is decent. I think it's good. You know what I mean? It's not annoying.
It's subversive. It's not what you would expect to hear from battle music. I didn't hate it.
It starts out as like elevator music, but then it transitions to like weird synth. Yeah.
And it's like and for for what I would like to assume pretty intense encounters with these mitochondria monsters, it's this very laid back like breakbeat elevator music that like I don't hate, but it's like it is very subversive, and that's that's a big reason why I think so many people hold the game in such high regard, is because it was so subversive. And whether or not all of the pieces worked well together or not, in whoever's opinion, it was very subversive. No one had seen anything like it at the time.
Truly,
like obviously,
like think of riding in New York on top of a horse carriage.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that scene.
The horse is on fire, and you're like have maybe like a 6x6 square foot area that you can dodge this woman who's still shooting laser beams at you. Like that is pretty sick. Like I again, for everything that like I've critiqued about this game, it's still really fun and really good.
It's literally spooky Die Hard, because it's just insane bombastic moments throughout the movie, and then by the end of the movie you remember, oh wait, this is a Christmas movie. After like 15 minutes earlier, you see Daniel jumping out of a helicopter, burst into flames, and throw Aya the special ammo. Like honestly, one of the coolest cutscenes I've ever seen. I don't even care how goofy and like over the top it is. Also, like just like for like just chunky human representation of having Daniel be like a fucking badass in like that context.
Well, and like, also too like seeing just a black person in like an RPG.
Yeah.
In a JRPG.
Oh my
like,
goodness.
That's not something that was definitely happening at the time. Even the.
And as much as a lot of the character portrayals do fall flat, I really also appreciate Daniel's story beats with his son. That felt
probably
very
one
real.
of the only times like you really get some characterization. You like the kid, you like that this dad cares about his kid. It does lead into some like narrative danger, especially when it gets to the park and the police station.
Yeah, like the guy loses his wife, who melts. Like and then finds out that the doctor had like information on them and stuff like that, and he gets very reasonably like upset at like a good few points in the game, and it's just like I feel that like when those scenes happen, and it's just like it's unfortunate that we don't get enough of that throughout the game from like the the cast of characters that we have, but I still can appreciate it for what we have.
I'm also just here for, and I say this very often, like modern world environments.
Oh yeah.
Like I love seeing them in RE2, RE3. Alan Wake has been really great, being in a little lakeside city and all the creepy things that can happen here. I think it's really cool that like shit going down in a park or a museum. Like I was a Buffy the Vampire Slayer kid. I say this a lot. So like, and these were like releasing / airing in tandem, because that's what like the highlight of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So like having that like, oh god, like there was no Buffy game then, so I can go through and feel like I am doing some of these things that are very similar to some of the media that I enjoy. Like it definitely like it hits just so hard on some of those things. Great, like setting 10 for sure.
And that's why that's why I personally love like the pacing and the setting for 1 more than 2, because it really honestly, it separates itself by days essentially for chapters, and that really does feel like episodes of like a Buffy type, television
In a way,
show.
yeah.
Yeah.
It does a good job of being like episodic, which I think is a big win for a lot of games when there is an arc that you can clearly see, especially like the lead up to Christmas, and being called
and
Parasite Eve, the
yeah,
entendre of Eve being there several times.
And for being technically RPG-ish in nature, and that label being connected to, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 hour games, and Parasite Eve really only barely being like 10 or 15 when you really sit down and just burn through it.
It is a breeze game.
I
for
can
sure.
appreciate that, despite all of its shortcomings, I don't feel like it overstays its welcome. Like, yeah, once you get through all of like the boring or kind of like clunky parts of it, it really doesn't overstay its welcome until the final boss. That I was not save scumming really throughout the game until the final boss. That shit just like had
I don't know.
me.
I'm a sucker for a multi-phase boss.
I liked the concept, but you're
playing a
dying.
Square Enix game. You're playing a Square Enix game, like you should know.
No, I know, and so it got to the point where I was save scumming after every phase, and then I beat the final phase, quote unquote, the final phase, and then, which I really do appreciate now that I'm not upset that it let me kill me at the time, when you beat the final phase and it turns into that last goopy, smaller creature, and it's chasing you across the boat in like a, kind of horror movie-esque chase scene, and the like camera angles are changing like every other area that you go into.
It goes to Resident Evil.
It really does, and
and
because you have no defense against it at this point, like after you've spent the entire game like blasting motherfuckers to hell, it really like it. I did not prepare for it, and I let it get to me, and it killed me because I did not save scum after I beat the final phase. Because I was like, okay, I beat the final phase, we're done, and then that scene starts, and I'm like, wait, what? And I go over, and you have to, talk to the people on the phone, and like, blah, 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 and it caught up to me, and I was like, no, and I had to beat the final phase again.
Maybe that's one of those things that the game could have used more of, was just tense moments like that, because I agree, like, I think that was a really cool tense scene.
Oh, it was great. I appreciate it. I'm just upset at myself for being caught off guard by it.
One other thing I want to talk about too, just because I love talking about it, and I already hinted at it before, it's just like, I think the boss battles in this are super iconic. I think that they are really, like, they set the scene really well for that tension that we were just kind of talking about. Did you have a favorite boss when you were playing this game?
I think in terms of kind of like gimmicks, I really liked the weird like sandworm boss that you fight at the park.
Oh, that boss
that's
cool. That is actually
because you have to kind of predict where it's going to like pop up next and stuff.
Well, and I think like too, that, don't quote me on this because it hasn't been that long. I played this game like 2 years ago. It hasn't been too far out, but I think,
I don't know, in Patrick years that's like 10, right?
Oh, hey, I'm Canadian. We actually age slower than everyone else.
It's all that maple syrup.
It truly is. Yeah. That's what you want to call it. I think if you shoot like all of them and you weaken them, then like each, like they maintain their hit points. I don't know if that's true or not. So I think like you can really cheese when it's at its largest phase if you like don't kill one all at once. But that might not be true. For some reason, I just remember like the last phase can be a pain in the ass if you have been only focusing on one at a time, because he's really hard to dodge, and he would have his full hit points. But I do like that boss. I think it's cool. It's cool seeing that, like, evolution of like, oh, I killed one and they got larger. Like that's kind of sick. I personally like the dog. I know it's really sad to like see something happen to a dog, but like it's like shit's gonna happen.
Yep.
Like,
no, as soon as I saw, yeah, this is Rosie, and I was like, don't tell me the dog's name.
Well, no, I mean not even that, but just like when you get to the police station and like you get all of the little scenes with the kid with the dog. And, like you know that like, okay, when am I gonna fight the dog? Oh, okay, when am I gonna fight the dog? And then the dog has 3 heads and it's shooting a giant laser beam at you. So. Yeah, I think that's a pretty sick one.
And just honestly, the lead up to that boss, like that part of the game where you're going through the police station and it's not a safe place anymore.
Yeah.
Like honestly, I really love that. I really love the recontextualization of the police station. It's this very like crazy, like you've spent at least half of the game at that point coming back to the police station for, you know, cutscenes and to re-up on ammo and gun stuff, and then to walk through the hallways and you're getting encounters was just like really jarring.
Yeah, it is.
It's
a good contrast to like no space is safe in Eve's world.
Yeah. So to just wrap up here, who would you recommend this game to in like modern day? Like who should go back and play this and find out how to play it? Because unfortunately, like this game series in general like has not had the legacy treatment that a lot of others had. I believe you can only play it on either original hardware or like the PS3 and Vita like Play stores, if those are even still open.
I think they are. I think they actually kept them open because that's actually how I replayed it, because we got me a Vita to like be able to record content, and unfortunately we got me the wrong one. But it made me able to like get a bunch of these PS1 RPGs that at the time like I didn't have any way of playing, and that's I played Breath of Fire 3 on it. I played that. I wouldn't be surprised, first of all, because I think Square Enix is truly doing their best. And I mean, I know they're really struggling financially, but like, and I also wonder how lucrative it is to do remakes. But I think they are trying to get a lot of their PS1 titles back out because they know how locked or how expensive or how hardware has changed where they don't look as nice. So I think it will come. I think if you are someone who either appreciates the classics, or if you are truly into like JRPG horror, I think it is a good game. I think you can see a lot of the impact that like A, Resident Evil had on it, but like B, that this had on games in general too. I think it had a lot of success. You know, it had 2 sequels, whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. But I do think it's still worth picking up, especially too because I know a lot of times people are like, oh, I want to play this classic game, and they're like, I'm going to play Final Fantasy 8 or 9, and it's like, well, that's 60 hours, bro. This game's 12.
Yeah.
So like it's bite-sized. Like it's very easy to just pick up and keep going with. What do you think?
Honestly, like, for someone who knew about the game for a while, picked it up a couple of years ago, got really frustrated within probably the first hour, and then picked it up again a couple months ago, and just powered through it. You know, I think anyone who wants to challenge themselves on older titles that, you know, have some more creative mechanics to them, I think you might find a sweet spot in something like this, because I was definitely not playing the game probably as intended, and I still ended up having a good time by the end, and I would probably go back and play again on a New Game Plus run. But for anybody who is familiar with this game and just has been looking to scratch that itch, there is a really awesome title coming out hopefully soon called 45 Parabellum Bloodhound that is very clearly taking heavy inspiration from Parasite Eve in its mechanics and battle system and stuff like that, with just a really nice crunchy early PlayStation art pixel style to it. Or sorry, not pixel, polygon style, but yeah.
With all sincerity, I would rather see Square Enix spend time rebooting some of these games and leaving Final Fantasy as it is, because
Oh
I
yeah,
like Final
for
Fantasy
sure.
is so solid that like there's not a title that you can't pick up and enjoy. But I think that some of these other titles that like were kind of the side projects could use some revitalizing. Like we kind of see it with Saga Frontier, Romancing Saga. You know what? We're bringing some of these titles back to life in a way. What was it? Uh, Heroes. No, Trials of Mana.
Right.
You know,
Yes.
like
Yes.
you know, like the get some. I think if we saw that with Parasite Eve 1, I think it would be energy in the right place, because we see like people are loving survival horror games.
Oh
Like
yeah.
Resident Evil, Alan Wake. We got Silent Hill 2 around the corner. If they did something like that with like some special powers, and they didn't make it too off the wall bonkers, like if it was a lot more grounded, kind of like Parasite Eve 1 is, with like the narrative and whatnot, then I think it would be a very successful game.
I think if they did something a little bit similar, not entirely like, but similar to what they did for the Resident Evil 2 and 3 remakes.
Absolutely, that's exactly how I see it.
That I think that they could do a lot of fun stuff, like, and just completely revitalizing that formula and like those mechanics, and just making them so much more smoother and much more accessible for like a modern audience. Maybe like bump up the narrative a little bit more and not have it feel so this is the last thing we worked on in the game type vibes.
I think that would be great. I know that some of the classic people would love it to still have like you have an ATV bar and you press a button and a sphere goes around you. And again, like, I don't find it hard separating the nostalgia from like quality. I think a lot of people do, where like this was really great then, so it's still great, and I just don't feel like that. Like I don't know how great that mechanic is.
I think it could be
now.
cool if they did something similar to what they did with Final Fantasy VII Remake, where you can choose to either have it be more action RPG oriented or more turn-based RPG oriented.
And I actually love how they did do that with Final Fantasy VII Remake, because
Like, it's
I think
very respectful.
Yeah, it really is. Like, I think the ATB bar, that's the perfect example for it, because if you could just spam your big spells all the time, the game would either have to balance it like that,
Yeah.
or it wouldn't feel fun. So, like, I have to do some things in order to get that. And this could be potentially the same. I don't know. But I think those days of, like, just how it was then, it's not going to work now. And I think that's why, because are you familiar with Vagrant Story?
Oh yeah, no, that I would love to start that one up again if the weapon crafting system didn't scare me so much.
Yeah, and like truly, and we'll talk about that a different day, but I think that's
sure.
why we haven't seen a continuation of Vagrant Story either, because I just think that those ideas, they were experimental and fun at the time, but I just don't think they, even going into PS2, would have held up. So
And I think that game releasing so close to, again, the end of the PlayStation 1's lifespan, just like that was kind of the beginning of the end of the era where developers could afford to experiment. So yeah.
Truly. Well, this was great.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on and just
thanking me for coming on my own podcast.
Thank you for letting us pick a bunch of T-Rex bones with you, reanimated T-Rex bones.
We didn't even talk about the T-Rex, but anyway.
All right, well, that's a wrap on today's bonus XP about Parasite Eve 1. Thanks for listening. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so be sure to like, comment, subscribe. If you want to be a part of the community, head over to the Discord at RPGaymer. We have a great community there, and we just have discussions going on about all kinds of things every single day. So we appreciate you all for listening and hope you had a great time. Now get out there and get gaming.